Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks for being patient. My name is Sarah Ladislaw. I'm the Director and Senior Fellow of the Energy and National Security Program here at CSIS. And I want to welcome all of you, both here in the room and on webcast, to the presentation of the New Energy Outlook 2017 by Bloomberg New Energy Finance. We are really pleased to host this presentation today. I'm going to keep my comments short because it's a long and substantive presentation that we're really excited to have here today, not only because we, as you all know, tend to like to present different forecasts for the energy sector, but there's a particularly large amount of interest these days in the future of clean and renewable energy resources, and I think BNEF does a really great job of digging down into some of the details about that change and some of the things that are the most pressing issues on policymaker and other energy stakeholders' minds. So really pleased to have this presentation here today. The main presenter today is going to be Seb Henbest, who's the NEO lead author, the head of Europe, Middle East, and Africa at BNEF. And then joining us for the discussion will be Elena Giannakopoulou. I did it right upstairs, I swear. I want credit for doing it right upstairs. Giannakopoulou, who's also lead energy economist at BNEF. And I also want to say a big thanks to Ethan Zindler, who is a senior associate or affiliate here at, at CSIS, who we really enjoy working with all the time and works at BNEF and was a big part of getting this outlook here today. So thank you very much. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Seb, and then we'll have a good discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you all very much for coming today to hear about our New Energy Outlook. It's a major exercise every year to do this, and there aren't many organisations in the world who try, and we hope that we can expose enough insights that are useful to our audience to help you all make important decisions over the next period of time about a very uncertain future. First, a bit about us. Bloomberg New Energy Finance is a specialist research division as part of Bloomberg. So we only think about energy. We've got people all around the world who are trying to understand the energy transition as it's playing out, covering a number of different areas, mostly focused on the new stuff. So one of the things that we specialise in is renewable energy, but also on electric vehicles and new forms of mobility, emerging technologies, frontier power, which is an off-grid sort of practice, but also we do a lot of work on power markets and gas. And the New Energy Outlook is essentially the culmination of a lot of the expertise that we bring to bear and the work we do throughout the year, all brought into one place. So my job today is to go through high-level key messaging. The report consists of 7 volumes, 3 regional, 1 focused on solar, 1 focused on wind, 1 focused on fossil fuels, and then a global synthesis. So there's a huge amount of content, and to try and make that accessible in a short amount of time, we're going to talk about 10 key messages. Before I do that, I need to tell you a little bit about what this is and what it's not, so you can interpret the results that I'm going to show you. And the first thing is this is a global analysis of the future, mostly of the electricity system. We do bottom-up modelling for 20 countries, but we cover the world. We start with demand. We worry about total demand, peak demand, load profiles. And then we use our view of the near term in terms of the pipeline of projects to be commissioned, plants to be retired, and our industry forecasts for solar and wind, gas, coal, etc., over the near term to give ourselves a view that is probably consistent with many of your views, but then we let the economics, the underlying economics of what we see in the data we collect take hold, and we model the supply mix out to 2040 on a least cost basis at a system level. An important feature is that we exclude subsidies once they've run their course. So this is not a study that's baked in the Paris Agreement or the Clean Power Plan or any other national aspirational targets that we see around the world. We can comment on those targets as a result of these findings, but they're not baked in a priori. This is well, we've done these reports all the way back to 2009, but this is the 4th time we've done a New Energy Outlook style report. Every year we refresh our inputs. That means we look at the cost of technology and how that's changing over time, fuel prices. We think about macroeconomic drivers, consumer uptake, whether that's electric vehicles or small-scale solar on people's roofs. We refresh all those inputs. This year, for the first time, we've included dynamic electric vehicle charging, which I'll talk about, which is basically allowing an electric vehicle fleet to charge in an optimal way rather than a fixed way. We now have batteries being deployed for peak demand in the modelling, which is essentially an economic exercise that says, is it cheap to use a battery or should we use gas or something else to meet peaks? Offshore wind has dropped a lot in cost over the last year, very surprisingly actually, and now we have a much better outlook for the cost of offshore wind, and that plays a small but pretty interesting role, we think, in the future. And finally, every year we try and make it a bit bigger, not just a bit better, and this year we've expanded it significantly, doing bottom-up modelling for a number of new countries in EMEA and Southeast Asia. We now model the US based on 7 ISOs and China on 6 grids. So it's a very big operation, and hopefully it's all worth the time that we spend on it. We'll let you be the judge of that. These are the 10 key messages, and I'm going to read through them quickly, and then I'm going to go through each one, some in greater detail, some in less detail. The first is that, in our view, solar and wind dominate the future of electricity around the world. Secondly, that solar's challenge gets increasingly serious, and this is a function of the cost declines that we've seen so far and what we expect in the future. But not just solar, the wind industry and wind energy is also coming down in cost very quickly for different reasons, but also offer a very valuable form of generation, we think, into the future. Perhaps the least surprising finding here is that China and India will dominate the amount of activity that we see around the world. Perhaps less intuitive is that we think there'll be new sources of flexibility, including batteries, that help to balance the variability of the supply side from wind and solar. That the distributed solar industry will grow, that home owners and businesses will continue to put solar PV on their roofs in increasing numbers around the world. That electric vehicles will not just add new demand to the grid, but they'll also help balance the grid, depending on when they charge and how they charge. Onto fossil fuels, and our conclusions maybe, this is topic du jour at the moment, which is the collapse of coal-fired power, but we look around the world, and certainly in Europe and the US, it's a downhill story. In other parts of the world, it's more mixed, but globally we think coal generation peaks in about 10 years' time. Gas as a transition fuel, we think it plays a role, but not in the way most people think. And this, of course, is the most controversial thing to say to a US audience, and we'll come on to that towards the end. And finally, we look at what all this means for emissions and how close we are to a 2-degree trajectory or not. So let's start at the top. These are the high-level findings. 10.2 trillion of new investment, the vast majority going to zero-carbon generation assets, and the bulk of that going to solar and wind. About 32% of total investment to wind, 27% to solar, 73% of that 10.2 trillion going to solar and wind. And if we break it down from a capacity basis, this is the world we're painting in 2040 from the world that we have today. Today, we've got about 61% of installed capacity being coal, gas, and oil. By 2040, we think that number's more like 28%. We see a 15-fold increase in large-scale solar, a 13-fold increase in small-scale PV, and a 4-fold increase in the capacity of onshore wind over the next 24 years. We have 13% less coal capacity, 16% more gas capacity. So there's a bit of a switch there. And finally, the pink segments at the top, we call flexible capacity, are these new sources of flexibility, demand response, batteries. It also includes more traditional sources like pumped hydro that help balance supply and demand intraday and also to a certain extent seasonally. And that pink segmentation there makes up 7% of total installed capacity, about the same as the oil-fired generation makes up today. Solar. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on this dot point because it underlines the fundamental conclusions that we're making and speaks to the deep dynamics of renewable energy versus more conventional sources. One of the central drivers of the impact and the rollout of solar energy worldwide, we think, to 2040, based on the previous charts, is the solar PV module experience curve, and I'm going to start there. This is a chart that, if you're not familiar with, I think I would argue, and maybe all of BNEF would argue, is the most important data set in Energy Economics today. It shows the decline on a log-log scale, so this is an exponential curve, in the cost of solar PV modules going back to the space program to today. And this is the curve that helps us think about the cost of solar into the future. That line there represents a 26.5% learning rate, which means for every doubling of capacity, you get a 26.5% reduction in the price of a solar PV module. And this is a very long data set. In January, we actually had to re-engineer it. And we came to a different conclusion when extracting this learning rate, that we now think that solar is getting cheaper faster than we thought a year ago. And the learning rate we're now using is 28% for solar PV modules. These cost declines are so steep that it's intuitive to think it's only a matter of time before they intersect the cost of other technology options. And so when we play this forward and we think not just about the technology costs, but also about the operational and balance of plant costs associated with building one of these things and the financing costs, the cost of capital, we can start to make conclusions about when these crossover points might occur. And so in the modelling, we can identify 2 tipping points. And we've mapped them out for you now, and these are underlying a lot of the results that we come up with. So the tipping point 1 is new versus new. When is it cheaper to build a solar plant or a wind farm rather than build a gas plant or a coal plant? This is China. The cost of a plant on the y-axis, time on the x-axis. And what this chart shows is the blue and the yellow lines, the wind and the solar, benchmark dollar per megawatt hour cost of these technologies crosses over the cost of building new coal in China by about 2019. The US. We get a crossover with new solar and new onshore wind in about 2023 with new CCGT gas plants. These are pretty profound results because we know that China has built and intends to build a lot of coal, and we know in the US gas is cheap, and we've built a lot of gas over the last few years, and we intend to build a lot more. But what we're suggesting is that in not too many years' time, a handful of years' time, these renewable technologies will get cheaper than the alternative conventional technologies that we expect to see a lot of into the future, or have expected to see a lot of into the future. Japan, the most expensive renewable energy in the world, partly because of the resources in the case of wind, and partly because it's supported by government to an unsustainably generous level, and as a result, it costs everyone just as much as the government is willing to pay them to deploy this technology. But as soon as those subsidies are removed, we expect the cost of solar to come crashing down because there's no reason it should cost so much in Japan compared to the rest of the world. Crossover points there between 2020 and 2025 against coal. The government's plan at the moment is to build a lot of coal to replace nuclear and the gas and oil-fired generation that came into being following the Fukushima disaster. Another important result, India. By around 2020, the standard new PV plant is going to be cheaper, we think, than a new coal plant in India. And we've seen a lot of the headline figures in terms of the competitive tendering for new capacity in India and other places in the world with prices way lower than the ones we're showing here. So this is not taking the cheapest that we see, but it's taking a benchmark value which we think is a reasonable price for these projects and mapping them forward. We already see solar at $29-ish in the Middle East, in Chile and Mexico similarly in the $30 range. So these numbers are much higher than that, but they give us a sense of the benchmark or the average. And these crossover points are still occurring in the very near future. Perhaps more important is tipping point 2. And this is saying, when is it cheaper to build a new solar plant or wind farm against running your existing coal plant or gas plant? Germany. Today, on a new-for-new basis, an onshore wind farm or a solar plant is probably cheaper than a gas or a coal plant. There's carbon pricing involved. There's other reasons why that's the case. But that technology is already cheaper new-for-new. By 2027, depending on which technology you're talking about, between 2025 and 2030, it gets cheaper to build a solar PV plant or a wind farm than to run an existing gas and then coal plant. In China, gas is already expensive to run relatively for baseload generation, but we see a crossover with solar and coal in 2030. This is a pretty profound result, because what it's saying is that this technology gets cheap enough, fast enough, that it starts to undercut the economics of existing assets that are being built today with a 30-plus year life expectancy within about 15 years. The US. Solar crosses the operational costs of an existing CCGT gas plant in 2027. And for India, maybe we actually never get to crossing over against coal compared to the cost of a new build PV plant. Very cheap to run the existing coal fleet in India. But these crossing points are really important because underneath this forecast is not a prediction of the future and layered with policy expectations and the pragmatism of actually making these sorts of changes. But underlying it is some stark sort of economic realities, which is these technologies are getting cheap fast enough that they not only outcompete conventional generation in the near term on a new basis, but in the medium term they start to outcompete existing generation from conventional assets. And if we allow these price signals to play out in our build and forecasting models, it means we start to get wholesale switches from old to new, first in countries where they need to build new capacity, and then everywhere when it can displace existing capacity. So all the results we show from now, think back to these charts because they do inform where we get to. Now that was all about solar, but certainly wind is also coming down in price as well. This is the turbine price index that we gather this data multiple times a year, and what it shows is about a 9% reduction in the cost per megawatt of new wind turbines going back to 1980 to today. But the machine that was built in 2008 and the machine that's being built in 2017 are just vastly different in wind technology. And it's not the cost reduction on a unit basis, it's the cost reduction on a dollar per megawatt hour basis, on the efficiency of that machine to extract energy from the wind field. The chart on the left there shows a set of observed capacity factors. That's the efficiency of wind farms going back to 2000-ish, and we can see the upward trend. This is actually a slightly old chart, and we're now probably above 30%, depending on whether you're using sort of P90, P50, P75, which is the probability of exceedance. So in other words, this is assuming, this is actually probably a low case based on those assumptions. But you can see at 50% up there is probably a wind farm in Texas or Brazil today. And by 2040 for the US, we think the benchmark, the standard, with a spread around it, is going to be around 50% in terms of capacity factor, and that's it reducing the cost of wind energy in the same way as we're seeing the reduction in cost of solar energy. But I mentioned offshore wind at the beginning as well, and offshore wind is really interesting because it was only a year ago in this forecast our conclusions were Europe's doing a bit of this for all sorts of interesting political reasons. There's renewable energy targets to be met. There's a portion of the population that doesn't want to look at wind farms on their horizon, on their farmland. Offshore wind can make a lot of sense if you've got these other constraints. But we said it's not going to be rolled out worldwide. It's too expensive. It's in the sea. There's salt. It's complicated. Push on 1 year, and we have seen projects being signed for delivery, not today, but in a few years' time, by 2020 at $50 a megawatt hour. That's cheaper than coal and gas in Europe. By 2024, we've got subsidy-free wind, offshore wind being offered, and that calculation of $50 is based on our view of what wholesale prices might be. And so going from the red line at the top, which was our central view, $200, very expensive, down to $50 is happening in a very short space of time. And there are some interesting reasons for this. One of them is that these turbines are getting really, really big. The chart on the left-hand side shows turbine size. Right now, the biggest turbines deployed offshore are 8 megawatts. If you've seen a picture of these things, they're quite remarkable in their size. But that German delivery for 2025, the expectation is there'll be 15 megawatt turbines. I can't even actually visualize a 15 megawatt turbine, but I'm sure someone has. The importance of this is that scale does really matter. And one of the challenges renewable energy has is it's much smaller scale than conventional sources, and adding a lot of generation quickly is a lot of smaller projects. Bigger projects mean less operations and maintenance because you simply have to visit fewer turbines out in the sea. It also means that the politics that I mentioned before of people's view on their coastlines in particular is not affected, so it's easy to deliver politically. And most importantly, that middle chart it actually offers a much more stable, steady generation profile. Onshore wind to offshore wind, this is Germany as an example, you can see the difference averaged out on an average day. Offshore wind is high and steady. One of the reasons for that is you are out in the sea. There's no topography to worry about to any meaningful extent, and that means you can get a more stable flow of wind through the turbines, and you can have the turbine lower to the ground as well, which reduces costs. On the right-hand side, you can see for the LCOE, the levelized cost of electricity, the comparative new build in Germany, and you see the reduction in costs of offshore wind, where it never crosses wind and solar in the traditional sense, but it gets into competitive territory. And that's a pretty interesting new development in this forecast. China and India. The least controversial conclusion, they're going to see a lot of activity. That's because demand is high, relatively, and as a result, we expect investment and capacity to be deployed. Asia Pacific, we think, sees almost as much investment as the rest of the world combined. A lot of that goes to wind and solar, the blue and the yellow, as you might expect. A large chunk to nuclear, which of course on an upfront capex basis is a very expensive technology to deploy. And in terms of APAC broken down, China and India take the lion's share, 83% of investment. Perhaps notable here is the small amount of black and grey, coal and gas, and the large amount of the renewable technologies. This is probably the part of the world where we see the most fossil and conventional energy being deployed. Without carbon constraints, there's a lot of demand to be met, and these technologies still for now are cheaper on the whole than renewables. But without dwelling too much on Asia, it gives me a chance to talk a bit about how we think about demand, because the underlying all this is a view of demand. And this is where we start, with quite a beautiful piece of statistical artwork, which a colleague in London puts together. And this is showing electricity intensity, which is the y-axis, dollars per unit of electricity, against wealth, if you like, GDP per capita on the x-axis. And when we think about demand, there's historically been this very neat interplay between, as economies get bigger, GDP grows, you use more electricity. Since the financial crisis in particular, this has demonstrably started to break down in a large number of countries. So our question was, what's going on? We can't just assume that GDP growth means electricity demand growth, but how do we think about it? Each one of these dots is a country, and it maps a point in time between 2000 and 2015. A lot of the red there in the middle is actually China broken down by province. On the right-hand side is the service-based economies of North America and Europe. On the left-hand side, the yellow with the agrarian, underdeveloped economies, mostly in Africa, and everything in between. Now, what's really tempting to do with a chart like this is to say, okay, well, if we can predict, or we have a GDP forecast, we can say something about electricity intensity, and that gives us an ability to forecast electricity demand. But what you might notice is that actually there are lines that emerge through this image, from the top left to the top right. And if we try and strip out some of the noise and then draw a statistical average through those lines, we can see that over time, that relationship between GDP per capita and electricity intensity moves down over time. And if we map it all out between 2000 and 2015, we can see that the relationship is moving. And our interpretation of this is the effect of increased energy efficiency. We are doing more with less across the world because just the energy efficiency we see in one country in the West is also deployed around the world to a greater or lesser extent. And that seems really intuitive. But it does mean that electricity demand growth is softened as a result for the same amount of GDP growth that we might expect. We map this forward to then try and understand everywhere from sub-Saharan Africa through the US where demand will go. And the decoupling effect that we've witnessed over the last, or since 2008 in particular, we think is really the play between increase in electricity demand as a result of GDP growth, population growth, and all the standard things, and the efficiency improvements. And when your GDP growth is low, your efficiency improvements beat it, and you get a decoupling effect. The economy grows much faster. You'll start to see that look more like the traditional trajectories that people have used for many years. So I wanted to touch a bit on demand because I think it's a very important element of the work and gives us a sense of how we come up with the scale in terms of the investment and activity that we see around the world. Batteries. So the biggest source of flexibility in a power market is the existing dispatchable thermal fleet. The gas plants, the coal plants, not so much the nuclear plants, but they can ramp up and ramp down as needed to match demand when required. And one of the great challenges of moving to a more variable renewables system is how do you make sure that you've got enough capacity and generation when you need it. And we think there's a huge role for the existing fleet that will continue to be available. It may not generate as much on an energy basis, but it will still be needed on a capacity and an energy security basis, be available to provide supply when required. But as you start to lose more of that firm capacity, as those crossover points kick in and you start to displace energy generated from coal and gas by the new renewable technologies as they get cheaper, you start to get a bit low on your availability of reliable dispatchable capacity to meet your peaks and to meet your seasonal extremes. And as a result, we think there's a bigger and bigger role for new sources of flexibility. So there's about, in this chart, there's small-scale batteries, large-scale batteries, demand response, and other sources of flexible capacity. That includes the pumped hydro and others. And we think there's about a $290 billion market opportunity for batteries playing a balancing role, either at small scale in people's houses and businesses or large scale, helping to meet peak demand. And this is a feature of the analysis that doesn't just assume that the technologies of the past are going to satisfy the needs of the future. And you can see the top 5 markets in 2040, which is probably, as you would expect in terms of size, where we see the most of this new flexible capacity being deployed. One of the items here is utility scale batteries. And in this iteration of the modelling, we've looked at utility scale batteries very specifically for their role in meeting peak demand. And we have a set of models that help us to assess the economics of using a battery versus using some other form of generation. And the obvious one is a peaking gas plant, which is, I suppose, well, that and an oil plant are probably the two most traditional forms of peaking capacity. And it's a really interesting dynamic because it's not just about the economics and the cost of the battery. We know batteries are getting cheaper, and we'll talk about that a bit more in a sec. But on the left-hand side is a schematic showing how the deployment of utility-scale batteries is limited by its own success. Because batteries are really good at ramping up quickly and hitting peaks, but they're not very good at discharging over long periods of time. So they're good at power, not so good at energy. And if you want a lot of energy out of the battery, that's your power times by the time it's operational, it gets really expensive. The top chart there says, okay, well, if you've got a peak, a battery can hit it. And it might be the cheapest thing to hit that peak. But as you've shaved that peak, the next peak's a bit wider, and then wider again, and wider again. And even as battery costs are coming down, the economics of using a battery to hit your peak starts to get worse in the opposite direction. So there's a wedge in that second chart at the bottom there, driven between the reduced capex of your standard battery and the marginal cost of meeting that next unit of peak demand. And so the chart on the right here suggests that is the economics that says, right, well, we think that this is for PJM, that by 2025, 27, it gets cheaper to use a battery than using gas to meet peak, but that's limited by its own success, and it tips back above that line again. So that's a cost chart. If you're the higher curve is the less economic. So we do this for all the countries we model, and we get some countries where this just doesn't play out. Gas is too cheap, it's the better alternative all the way through to 2040. And other places where batteries are a really good alternative the whole way through, particularly if you get lots of renewable energy kicking in, creating sharp peaks in the evening, and other examples like that. Solar PV on rooftops. This has been a part of our analysis for a number of years. Consumer uptake is an increasingly important part of the energy matrix, whether it's vehicles on the electric vehicle side, whether it's small-scale solar or small-scale solar and batteries. So this looks like a very complicated chart, but I'll explain it, and it's really intuitive after I've done that. On the x-axis is how sunny a place is. On the y-axis is the variable part of the retail tariff. That's the bit you don't have to pay if you don't use electricity from the grid. Sweeping through on the yellow line is the cost of a solar system. The advantage solar has at a retail level is it's tapping into a much higher price point than at a wholesale level because it's not paying for the poles and wires to get the electricity from the large-scale power station to your house. And as a result, its economics look way better than than utility-scale solar, despite the fact we think that's looking increasingly compelling. Above that yellow line are countries where it is more expensive to use the grid than use solar, and below the line are countries that have the opposite. So in 2015, we think there are a number of countries that are essentially at socket parity on average. Now, this hides a myriad of complexity and different tariff structures and different parts of the grid with different prices, but on average, rooftop PV is essentially competitive in a very large number of places in the world today without subsidy. You push forward 25 years and two things happen. The cost of solar comes down, that yellow line drops. In some countries, the cost of the power goes up. In other countries, that cost of that retail component goes down. In Europe, we assume that there's tariff restructuring and you see less of the bill on your variable component. But that solar curve still beats it. So the conclusion of this is that in the not too distant future, it's just going to be economic everywhere to put solar on roofs, if you've got a roof space. And the amount we get is constrained by that. And it's also constrained by the uptake dynamics of imitation and penetration. But ultimately, these economics aren't going to get any worse unless there's full retail tariff restructuring around all-you-can-eat tariffs with a single payment. But that's got other complications. So this is a really important space to watch, and we see a lot of rooftop solar in the absence of any policy intervention to reshape tariff structures. And the important thing here I mentioned before is it's not just this economics, it's about penetration and imitation. And that's the same for electric vehicles. Once you hit a certain critical mass and the economics look good enough, you start to get people doing this, and we can see that around the world already today. An example for Mexico and Brazil, by 2040 we think that small-scale PV in Mexico is about 17% of total electricity generation. For Brazil, it's 20%. The important thing is those net demand curves, which is the demand from the grid for utility-scale assets, start to flatten out. So if you own one of these assets, your electricity demand growth in these countries starts to look increasingly less favourable as we get out beyond 2030 and small-scale PV starts to reach some sort of critical scale. And in somewhere like Australia, we can identify a decentralisation ratio, which is not just the PV, but also the batteries. And when we add up all that capacity, we think about 45% of total capacity in the electricity system in somewhere like Australia is small-scale behind the meter. And we think about the movement of value from upstream to downstream, that's a significant amount of value in that market that now is revolving around consumer preferences, consumer choices, and product types. And you see all the utilities, whether it's Germany, Italy, Australia, all starting to move downstream to follow this. Electric vehicles. So I've got to be careful with electric vehicles because we're doing a bigger launch announcement in about a month on our new vehicle forecast that has ramifications for oil demand, which I'm sure many of you are very interested in. I'm not going to talk about that today, but I'm going to talk about the amount what it means for electricity demand. And it starts with battery costs. On the left-hand side, the green dots you can see are surveyed average prices for battery packs going back to 2000. Much shorter time series than solar or even wind, but it demonstrates about a 19% learning rate. 90% reduction in prices for every doubling of capacity. And this is before the major manufacturing hubs, whether it's Tesla here in the US or it's BYD in China. There's a number of very large manufacturing hubs coming online over the next few years, which we think may even put further downward pressure on this. But if we map those cost declines further forward, we get down to about $73 a kilowatt hour by 2030. And this has important ramifications for the cost effectiveness of stationary storage in the electricity system. I'm going to rush over this because this is some of the stuff I'm going to get in trouble for showing, but you can see the uptake of EVs on the left turning into a certain amount of electricity demand out to 2040, split around a large amount in the US, China, and in Europe. What does this mean in terms of that grid demand picture I showed before? Quite interestingly, this is for Germany, showing net demand, gross demand, small-scale PV. Is EVs can help arrest that net demand for the utility? So the more electric vehicles you've got, the more demand we're likely to see from the grid for the same amount of small-scale solar, because that's happening on a completely different dynamic, which is consumers making a decision outside the system. But perhaps most importantly here is that it matters when these things charge. And this is a chart that shows for the UK a daily load profile in 2040. You can see the general load has an evening peak, as you might expect. But as you add EV demand to that load profile, whether it's fixed, i.e. people plug in when they get home on some standard profile, charging overnight mostly, or whether it's dynamic, they're plugged in during the day at work. And then they draw a charge from the grid when demand is low and prices are low. This changes the shape of demand, and historically in electricity systems, demand has been relatively fixed beyond a few major changes. Over time, the structure of the economy changes slightly, demand shape will change slightly, become more peaky and things, but this is a reasonably fixed proposition that suppliers had to scramble to meet. And what we're going to see increasingly in the future is demand being more flexible, whether it's because of these electric vehicles charging or because of demand response shaping that peak, or other things that we haven't even yet thought of, but demand will become increasingly dynamic and match an increasingly dynamic supply set at the same time. The important thing here actually is that it shows that when PV gets really cheap, and you start to get it everywhere, even the UK, which is not very sunny, but eventually that kit gets cheap enough you start to see it, you tend to get a lot of charging during the day using that cheap PV, providing demand and a price signal for those asset owners, and also providing cheaper electricity for car owners as well. So very quickly on coal, gas, and then emissions. This is the picture for coal-fired generation out to 2040. That is about an 87% drop in coal generation in Europe, and about a 52 or 3%, I think, drop for the US. In this part of the world, that's not a controversial thing to say. You've been witnessing a decline in coal-fired generation now. So it's about 45% for the US. Witnessing a decline in coal-fired generation since gas got cheap. On the other side of the ledger, though, it's a more mixed story. So this is for China, India, Southeast Asia, where you have demand for coal generation growing. In China, we think it peaks about 2026 and then starts to fall quite rapidly. And it's at the point about 2030 when we think that the cost of new renewables starts to undercut existing coal generation in China that you really start to see that kick in. If I put these on the same axis, though, you get a sense of the scale of China versus the rest of the world. And what's going on in the US and Europe is matched by what's going on in India and to some extent in Southeast Asia. But we're thinking about coal demand worldwide. It's really all about China. An important thing that I gave you a sneak peek of then was the change in our forecast for India between last year and this year. Last year, this is what the picture for India looked like in terms of coal demand. It almost reached China by 2040. This year, we're significantly lower, and that's because of the increased competitiveness of solar in that market and the price discovery that we've now been able to observe and the data we've been able to collect looking at the price of building solar in India, which now we think is significantly lower than we thought a year ago, because we've seen more plants being financed, more plants be put into the ground at much lower price points. So that's a really good news story in terms of coal generation and emissions. But ultimately, China matters, and the global coal generation curve there peaks in 2026 in line with China. So what China does between now and 2040 matters a lot for coal consumption and ultimately a lot for emissions. Gas. So our conclusion about gas is a bit mixed. Last year we said gas does not play a role as a transition fuel, and this year we thought that was probably too coarse a statement. And this year we're saying gas is a transition fuel, but not in the way most people think. There's very little evidence globally that we're going to move from coal-fired generation to gas-fired generation to renewable generation in some sort of linear, calm, orderly fashion. Partly it's because renewables are getting very, very cheap very quickly, way cheaper than people thought when they came up with this idea that gas could be some sort of transition fuel. Where it does make sense as a transition fuel is actually here, because gas is very cheap, and it's much cheaper than most other places in the world. Coal is generally cheaper in Asia. Coal is generally cheaper in Europe, while its carbon price is languishing where it is. So when we look at gas burn over the next 24, 25 years, we see it actually increasing. We see an 8% increase in the amount of gas burn out to 2040. We see $804 billion invested in new gas-fired power stations and 16% more capacity worldwide. The point is that a lot of that capacity is not providing bulk generation. And when we look at the decline in the amount of coal generation worldwide versus the increase in gas generation worldwide, there's no one-for-one relationship here. We're seeing a lot more coal come offline than we see gas come online, because a lot of that generation from coal, that bulk generation, is being made up by renewables, which are significantly cheaper than gas, especially by the end of the forecast. And you can see this here. Again, I'll use Germany as an example. It's just a nice, neat example for a lot of these trends. And this is the picture in 2017: baseload gas, baseload coal, peaker gas, nuclear, hydro, into the renewables at the top. By 2030, you can see the impact of renewables squeezing baseload gas and coal generation, but increasing the need for peaking gas, because all that renewables has to be balanced. And by 2030, it's generally cheaper to use gas than batteries and other forms. So you can see the pink sections at the top going up over time, because that means we are adding some new sources of flexibility at the same time. But that's the sort of picture we're painting. Lots of renewables, gas playing a supportive transitional role, coal copping a lot of the generation reductions. And finally, onto emissions. We think that emissions will peak by about 2026, same year as coal in China, and then decline. From last year, we're slightly higher in the near term, lower in the long term, and that's, again, is all to do with the shape of China. A year ago, we thought that Chinese demand was flatter than it ended up being, and that's, we think, mostly a political decision in terms of stimulating heavy industry in China where the fundamentals don't necessarily exist. But we need to watch that space, because that's very determinant of what picture we see here. In terms of the NDC trajectory, we're on track, and by 2030, we think we drop below based on the economics that we've identified and play out in this forecast. That probably means that countries can be more ambitious than they are without worrying about additional cost. This is actually will be a least cost scenario to start to look a lot more like our forecast than what they currently have in their NDCs. But when we think about the distance of 2 degrees, it's still a very, very long way away. That trajectory, you can pick all sorts of different trajectories for 2 degrees depending on when you start and what shape you what you want to travel. And you can pick all sorts of different configurations of generation to get there. You can do it all with nuclear. You can do it all with wind, potentially. You can do it all with an array of different technologies. So this is just a scenario which says we need an extra 5.3 trillion in investment in zero carbon generation technologies to get on that trajectory over the next 24 years. And that's a lot more than, we currently have 10.2 trillion in total out to that point in time. So it's another 50% on top of the total investment for all generation to get to 2 degrees. Whether we can get there or not is a really important question, because the power sector is the sector that has the most flexibility to get to this sort of trajectory. But ultimately, we're going to have to see a ramp up in activity well beyond what we've painted here, requiring policy intervention to get there, to get even close. And that's going to require some pretty heavy soul searching in terms of the scale of the task. But the good news is that the tipping points are coming, that the technology is getting cheaper, that it's going to become increasingly cost effective to roll out the old and roll in the new. And so we have some optimism that we could achieve that target with the right amount of political focus. Thank you very much. That ends the presentation.
That was fantastic. So 50 slides, 50 minutes. It was that was really well done. Okay, so there's a lot in your outlook, and I want to start with a couple of questions, and then we'll turn to the audience and try and get in as many of your questions as we can. We've got about a half hour left. Okay, so maybe starting back at the basics. I know you guys do a comparison of how your outlook compares with a lot of other outlooks, or a couple other outlooks. I don't want you to do like a line by line on that, but in the basics, in the basic inputs, are you basically aligned with the other energy outlooks that you compare yourselves with in terms of how you assume growth? Because we tend to think that growth, GDP growth assumptions for the next decade and next 2 decades are really important to how people view fuel competition and all of these sorts of things. So are you broadly aligned on things like that? How do you view the policy landscape, right? So is this everything that people have pledged and then some? Is it policy continuity in terms of renewable energy subsidies over that period? I was particularly interested in India. So, you've got a lot of coal power generation getting eaten away by solar, and I'm just curious about, is that because of the targets? Is that because of the policy mandates as well as the economics, that sort of thing? So could you just go back to the very basics of this and say, broadly, are you bringing the same assumptions about overall level of investment, economic growth, and policy that some of the other major outlooks that people will be more familiar with are?
Thank you. Let me start with that one. I'm conscious that Elena is, has a huge amount of knowledge about all this sort of stuff, and is sort of most of the brains behind this. But let me start with that high-level question, because it's a bit of a framing one. The answer is we don't forecast stuff that we know nothing about. So in terms of GDP, population growth, these sorts of parameters, we use, I think probably what everyone would use, we use the World Bank and the IMF, and we use people who are meant to know something about that. So there's some commonality probably there. I think where we then differ is how we relate those underlying macroeconomic indicators to electricity demand, I think is different. Mm-hmm. That Rembrandt-style chart that I showed is our way of is our lens through which we see those macroeconomic indicators translate into electricity demand and electricity demand growth. So I think there's a difference there. Mm-hmm. In terms of policy, it's a really important point, because what we do is try and strip away policy. So we're not trying to show you how you would get to a policy-laden outcome based on Paris or the Clean Power Plan or anything like that. What we're trying to do is strip that away and look at the underlying economics as we see them based on the technology cost evolutions and the electricity system, and optimising that based on the technologies we know and some we don't. Mm-hmm. So as a result, it shouldn't be viewed as a policy-driven exercise at all. It should be the opposite of that. Mm-hmm. It should be viewed as sort of pure economic tipping points over which we would overlay policy, politics, the inertia of vested interests. So when we say, is this not a prediction? Well, it's not a prediction because the rates of change and the timing is going to be skewed by all sorts of things, as it always has and probably always will, because energy is such an important sort of good in the economy. So the India question in terms of the amount of coal and solar, that is purely about the economic optimal economic solution as we see it. It just gets so cheap to use solar in India. Mm-hmm. It's very sunny. The technology gets cheap. There's no reason why it should be more expensive in India. Actually, it's one of the cheapest places in the world today, so why would that be different in the future? Mm-hmm. And ultimately, these technologies just cross over the cost of fuel-based generation. Okay.
I'll come back on the solar question, but Elena, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think
you're good. Okay, all right. So then let's go to solar really quickly, because I think you have a lot of solar in your outlook, and I think one of the things we spend a lot of time focusing on is not just, and I think you guys do the same thing, but is not just how much generation capacity is economic to build, but how does it integrate itself into an electric power system, right? So do your solar numbers include things like integration costs when you get to particular regions where you're getting to higher and higher levels of penetration? You mentioned in one of your statements that you aren't looking at large regulatory or subsidy overhauls, but I want to unpack that a little bit, because there is a lot of concern about whether or not you get to certain levels of solar penetration and the incentive system doesn't work the same way, right? And so we don't need to go down that rabbit hole, but I just want to ask whether or not, or how you deal with that within your solar forecasts.
So there are two ways that we model solar. One is the small-scale PV installations, so the residential and commercial installations that Seb described, and the consumers only care about offsetting the retail prices, so they don't care about the system. And this is exogenous to the rest of the analysis. So that's one thing that fits into our modeling. And then the way that we are thinking about is we are modeling a power system, so we ensure that there is the least cost combination of technologies, but at the same time that the system is secure, that lights stay on, and that this system meets the needs of the consumers. So our analysis is quite detailed in this sense. With this high penetration of variable renewable energy, we haven't seen any issues considering the rest of the technologies. For example, Seb talked about gas that is becoming, peaking technology. In addition to the traditional sources, we also have an extra mix of technologies, what Seb described as the flexible capacity there, which is small-scale batteries, utility-scale batteries, pumped hydro, interconnectors, demand response, all these technologies that come into the system. They absorb this variability of solar and wind and ensure that our system is stable.
Do you, in any of your regional work, which I guess another question is sort of how much do you sort of drive this down into sort of regional looks, which I imagine you do in a 7-volume study, you'd have space to do that, right? But how much of that do you get to places where on a systems-wide, like on a modeling basis, right, the models can sort of work it out, right? But like the actual implementation of it is actually more difficult than that, right? So if you have negative pricing for electricity in some places or those sorts of things, like do you go through your analysis and point out places where you're actually going to have a hard time, where the model's actually going to have a hard time solving for itself?
So there is one fundamental principle of this modeling. So we don't use the price signal, the wholesale prices, as the signal for new capacity to come in. So the standard we take is that this is a least cost approach, and hence the system operator will ensure that the market structure is the right one, or will create the right signals for this capacity to come online.
I mean, just to add to that, I think that's the important point, is that if you get bogged down worrying about what is your price signal today, mapping it forward to 2040, you soon come to the point where there's no price signal in 2040. That renewables, because they run at very low or close to zero marginal cost, eat their own price signal. Right. Yet this stuff is really cheap electricity. So when you're pricing based on the marginal cost of generation, and you've got a technology that's cheap on a lifetime basis, but doesn't have a price signal, you've got to think about how are you remunerating that system service. Yeah. And you've got to think about how you then remunerate all the other system services from the conventional capacity to enable demand to be met at any one time. So our expectation actually is that on a least cost system based in terms of generation, this is what we think would be a least cost. But to get there, you would need significant market redesign to provide the right price signals to remunerate people to do this. Yeah. And beyond that, you would require an overhaul of market regulations, and you would require sort of an overhaul in the standards and the rules which determine who can do what in the market. Because at the moment, a lot of this stuff around the world has been designed for a set of technologies and a demand curve, that is growing, and we think it's much flatter in general. It's been designed for the past, and so there's a really, really big job for regulators and government to embrace the reality of these technologies, and to plan their systems accordingly. Because if you don't, you get an example like Australia. Yep. We spent 10 years arguing about carbon pricing, and as a result, the lights went out in South Australia. Yeah. And that's a complete failure in energy policy to see what was coming, getting bogged down in old arguments and politics.
Yeah. Okay, one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to everybody for their questions. Nuclear. So we've got a big debate in the U.S. about what's going on with nuclear. We've got existing plants closing early, and a lot of it has to do with cheap gas, but a lot of it has to do with the transitions that we're talking about in the electric power systems and the regulation and the market models and all of that sort of thing. One question, how do you see that going out over your forecast? But then two, do you see it happening in other markets around the world? And if so, where?
That's a very interesting question. The reason is we are also thinking about nuclear and the role that it plays in the system. And in terms of our analysis, nuclear is the big exception in terms that we don't build nuclear based on economics, because compared to the rest of the technologies, nuclear is not competitive, like anywhere across the world. So, and because of the long lead times that this technology has, 8 years, 10 years, we can have a very good visibility of the pipeline. So the thing with nuclear is that, in a way, is exogenous to our capacity build. And because, as I said, the economics don't look extremely attractive. And the reasons that the countries have these nuclear plants are slightly different. So a lot of times it has to do with politics. Some of the times it has to do with the support of the industry, like China. And globally, there are only a few places that we see right now, and over the next 25 years, nuclear playing a role. It's limited to China because of the industry, as I said, India. There are some plants in Middle East. We're still waiting to see how this will go. But we don't see like a huge growth in the market.
Do you that's a lot of new build, right? So is there a threat to existing nuclear facilities based on the economics of just their operation over longer livelihoods? I mean, I know some places are, again, that's a policy issue as well, because some people are retiring existing nuclear fleets of a policy proclivity, but in other places, it's a question of whether it continues to run the economics of existing nuclear.
Yeah, I mean, I think we generally let nuclear live out its life in most places, unless there's a specific policy agenda to retire it. And in parts of Europe, we sort of see that playing out in Germany and France to a certain extent. So we see some reduction in the nuclear fleet in those parts of the world. The US is a really interesting case. Colleagues in New York, I mean, we're publishing on these sorts of issues all year. So this is an aggregate at a certain point in time, and we have to make a call on some of these sort of difficult. Even though we don't assume new policies, we have to make some policy decisions in there. Sure. And nuclear is a tricky one, because what we've assumed in the modelling is that the existing, beyond what we can see in terms of any decommissioning pipeline, the existing nuclear fleet in the US is supported. It's supported partly because we think there is a lot of jobs at stake and it's a strategic industry. It's supported partly because maybe for decarbonisation reasons. If you let the nuclear fleet get pushed out of merit today, then you're replacing it with gas. If you let it get pushed out of merit at the end of lifetime by 2030 plus, you replace it with renewables. So there's lots of reasons why you might keep nuclear going, all of which are a policy decision, because I think we published a note yesterday, the team in New York, or the day before, which sort of said, gave this, I don't know the exact fraction, but it's a very large fraction of the nuclear fleet in the US which is currently underwater. So that becomes a big policy. There's a lot of generation that maybe shouldn't be there on a pure economic basis, but as Elena said, we treat it differently because it is different. Yeah. It's a geopolitical industry in many ways, and we give it that special status.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, I'm going to open up. Please just wait for the microphone. State your name and affiliation and question in the form of the question. We're going to go over here. I'm going to take these three here, and then we'll go over to this side of the room.
Thank you very much. My name is Lin Ji, and I'm from Energy Blockchain Labs. We are working on applying blockchain technology to green finance worldwide, and we have some cooperation with institutions like China's Central Bank, MIT, IBM, and so on. And my question is, what role do you think will financial technology play in green finance in the future, especially in the US and China? Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Ajay Chouan with Audi of America, doing EV strategy. My question is about the assumptions for EV adoption that you presented earlier. Specifically, is it purely price driven, or like when the vehicle cost comes to parity with a conventional vehicle, or are there consumer adoption behaviors that are included in your model as well? Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Justinian Yi. I'm with Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions. I wanted to touch on your point for gas being a transition fuel, especially for our country. Here in the United States, as far as I've been concerned, I understand our production of gas has been increasing, but that there's still a lot of untapped resources in states like Alaska and Pennsylvania. So my question is, given the predictions for increasing capacity for gas to be a transition fuel, would we need to tap into previously untapped resources for additional natural gas? Thank you.
Let me tackle them. First of all, in this piece of work, we don't go to the level of detail to working out where all the finance is coming from. We've done this in the past, a couple of years ago actually, looking at that distance to a 2-degree trajectory, the extra 5 trillion or so, a couple of years ago. I can't remember exactly what the number was, but we then looked at how, what different asset classes might make that up, based around some assumptions about the direction of travel. Breaking it down by debt and equity and green bonds and this, the whole universe that came up with. So we haven't done it for this turn, and I think that document is publicly available. And so at this point, I'm going to direct you towards it. I think it was put out by us in combination with CSIS, and if you Google that, my colleague at the back, Ethan Zindler, probably can give you the exact web address because he was heavily involved. But that's a view of that question. On the EV adoption side, it's a consumer uptake exercise. So we worry about not just the economics, but also the penetration and imitation effects. Consumer uptake modelling, like with the PV, is like extremely sensitive to the parameterization of the S-curves that you build. And so we have you've got to find proxies to establish those curves, and we have limited data in terms of EV uptake. We have more for PV, and even then it's tricky because there are certain conditions locally that skew the underlying sort of human element to that. But we did it that way, and then in terms of the economics, we're looking at a combination of the sticker price, so the nameplate price, and the total cost of ownership. So in general, you start to hit a tipping point when the sticker price matches. So when you go to the car dealership and the same number is on the windscreen of the electric and the internal combustion engine vehicle. And then beyond that, the uptake rate, we factor in the total cost of ownership. And I think the reason why we do that is we think it's a more accurate reflection of how people actually buy these things than what would be a pure economics basis, which is, well, the lifetime of the asset and worrying about that way. So the short answer is, yes, consumer uptake. Yes, we have to think about penetration effects, and yes, we use the sticker price as the primary price signal. And so the battery cost that our curves suggest helps us define those crossover points in sticker price, which I think are around, on average, around 2025, depending on the size of the vehicle, a bit later for smaller cars, a bit earlier for larger. But that's when we start to, it presses a button in the modelling and we start to see uptake accelerate. And the final one, I took these ones, Elena, because I thought I could answer them. You get the next one, next set that might be harder. And in terms of gas as a transition fuel and tapping previously untapped reserves, I think one of the features of the gas market over the next 5+ years is going to be the huge amount of supply coming online globally. So when we think about LNG, we have a huge oversupply situation emerging as the LNG trades in Australia and elsewhere come online, and more gas is actually released through the US avenues as well. So at this stage, the amount of gas that we expect, which is 8% higher than today, doesn't require us to go and find all sorts of new gas reserves globally. It would depend on the domestic policy situation and the rate at which the existing wells producing gas through shale and exhausted, and the expectation of how much gas we can get out of those. And I think there's a certain amount of guesswork applied to that. So we don't anticipate that it's going to require huge amounts of new exploration globally. Locally, there might be political reasons why that's the case. And actually, interestingly, one of the uncertainties of these conclusions is it's not a global equilibrium exercise. We're not balancing everything all at the same time. It's partial equilibrium, which means that we've got to take a view on gas prices. And one of the sensitivities that we probably need to do more exploration of is looking at the result of oversupplying the gas market and where those gas cargoes are going to go and what that might mean to the gas price assumptions in countries where today gas is expensive, and whether that starts to actually work in gas's favour as an industry worldwide. There are certain feedbacks and iterative effects there that we haven't fully investigated yet, but you could imagine a situation where gas plays a bigger role if there's enough supply coming online and demand is relatively weak from the power sector.
And probably one of the things that we've been spending time working on is looking at the extent to which gas players in the global gas markets are trying to innovate on their own business models, right? Because they see exactly what you've presented, which is, especially in a low-growth environment, distributed renewables lead a lot of market share, and coal can win out in a lot of environments, and you actually have to lean forward to make those gas markets work. And so you're starting to see people think about the next iteration of global gas and LNG capacity as more of a strategic playing field. And so there could be a lot of innovation on that side too. Yeah. Okay, well, let's go to this side of the room.
Richard Bowers, Energy Information Administration. So with your learning curves for offshore wind, you talk about offshore wind costs declining faster than onshore, but how does this, because they're different age of technology, how does the cost curve for what you're seeing for offshore compared to the same kind of time period in its lifespan as, say, onshore was? And are we seeing similar cost curves? Well, although we'd expect onshore to decline slower at this point because it's an older technology, how does that compare to where offshore is?
Yes, hello. My name is Prab Singh from Pro Energy. So I'm curious to ask you, when you made this report, who did you got it validated with? Because I see this report made by a lot of financial associates and professionals, but I don't see any utilities or RTOs, because I saw the source. It just said BNEF. I mean, who else participated in making this report, especially foreign utilities in China, Japan, all those guys? Who made them? Could you give us like better sources? Who else, helped you made it?
Hi, Bill Eichhorn, consultant. A little more granularity on the battery issue. I was wondering, you talked about the cost reductions and technology improvements in batteries for automobiles, but how about at the utility scale? Are you making the same sort of linear assumptions? And secondly, on batteries, one thing that struck me is that the $20 billion per year market by 2040 seemed a little bit small relative to a $350 billion a year renewables market. So could you talk to that a little bit?
Hi, Rich Tusing, DOE's EERE division. Really, congratulations on an amazing report. When I look at the key drivers related to the overall NEO, much of it is driven by your cost assumptions related to both solar and wind. Those are the absolutely bedrocks that drive your economic competitiveness. Personally, when I look at the technological drivers that are driving the scaling and as you were showing the capacity factor levels for wind, I can see how you can get to the levels for where your solar rates are expected to be. Can you talk a little bit about your confidence level and your basis for how you think about how a 28% learning curve could be sustainable as module costs continue to get to actually just component cost and just materials cost, how to continue to achieve that kind of 28% continued learning curve, because that's such a fundamental driver in the nature of your assumption. Thanks.
You got one? Yeah. Okay, Derek, can you bring him a microphone?
It's a little bit like the last question, but it has to do with natural gas. Are your natural gas price assumptions constant? And if solar and wind begin to compete very effectively with natural gas in power generation, and you don't use gas, then the price of gas is going to drop. which is going to make gas competitive again. So you have to, it could be a leapfrogging kind of thing of if your solar and wind costs drop, you might see gas prices drop too, and then it creates an interesting situation.
Maybe if I can just piggyback on Adam's, not to add another one, but just to say, when we have other folks who are not in the business of looking at sort of renewables and clean energy technology and those sorts of things, they get a lot of criticism on the way that they forecast those, right? So you guys get a lot of credibility because you guys probably do the best numbers in the business on looking at the sort of economic viability of these things. But do you think you work as hard on looking at sort of the innovations on the gas side, innovations on the nuclear side, those sorts of things? I mean, because I think that's one of the difficulties of energy systems analysis, right, is that we feel like we sort of miss things because we're focusing so hard on things that are changing quickly that we sort of miss these other things. And, the gas is sort of the example of the day, but there could be others. So anyway, you've got a lot of questions.
Let me start with this one. So we expect an around 75% reduction on $1 per megawatt hour for offshore wind and about 42% for onshore wind. And there are two reasons for that. The first one is that offshore wind has a higher starting point. So right now we're at 150. There is enough innovation in the market, but what is extremely important as well is that we see higher capacity factors in offshore wind industry. So the onshore wind turbines operate right now on average at 28-30%, while offshore wind goes up to 45, even 50% capacity factor. And this is very important, as Seb showed. The capacity factors when it comes to the wind turbines is one of the two main drivers that brings the cost down. So that's why we see a steeper reduction in offshore wind. So is there something that you would like to add for onshore and offshore? Okay, because we have a list of questions. Now,
maybe one thing which is important is that because of the way that offshore wind is being procured, firstly, there's a lot of competition, which is driving down costs really quickly. And you've got a huge number of industries pouring in to the offshore sector that are good at offshore things. So we're seeing the oil and gas industry moving into the sector. And there's a number of reasons why you're getting a critical mass of interest and activity and government support in the way that the onshore wind sector sort of never, hasn't had for a long time. It's had a lot of opposition. So when we look forward, we don't expect suddenly everyone's going to go, yes, more onshore wind turbines, let's put them everywhere. But we may see that with offshore wind in an increasing way. So I think there's a certain amount of momentum behind offshore wind, and the price discovery of that momentum has created an auction schedule that's given us forward visibility of prices. So when we talk about a $50 offshore wind price, they are prices that have been struck for delivery in 2020 to 2025, down from 150-ish today. So, and these are not cowboy companies. These are some of the major companies in energy companies in Europe and around the world. Shell, Dong Energy, the list grows. So we have some confidence that these guys know what they're doing, and we'll probably deliver on these prices. And then we think, what happens from there? And it helps us to inform that slightly sharper downward trend as well.
Mm-hmm. Learning curve question with the solar one. Sustainable? No.
The 20%, 28%, yes. So we have a team in Beijing, actually, that is sitting very, very close to the industry, and they are looking at the innovation that there is right now in the pipeline. So they are looking at all the different cost reductions that we have, not just on the cost of the panel, but also the inverters, like all the different cost components. And this 28% comes with every doubling of capacity that we experience in the installations. So yes, in this sense, the team that is looking into this is fairly confident that there is enough innovation to keep us on this experience curve.
It's also asymptotic, remember, because the 28% is an annual 28%. It's 28% for every doubling of capacity. And as the industry gets bigger, it gets harder and harder to double capacity. So the cost declines do that. And on the chart, it looks straight because you've got log axes. So yeah, the costs do slow down in terms of their dollar per megawatt in the market, what we think the solar price will be, but the ongoing improvements we think are still there.
So, as Seb mentioned, there is some data that come from different sources, like GDP, like population, but anything that has to do with our forecast, experience curves, economics, the source is Bloomberg New Energy Finance, because we have different teams that are coming up with this information. So we try to list all the different sources when we use them, but all this work is based on the proprietary data and information that we have at Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and hence the sources. Let me start. And there are a few things. So the same way that we have our solar team that is looking into the different experience curves, our onshore and offshore wind analysts that are looking at the economics of onshore and offshore wind technologies, we have our gas team, and we also have our regional power teams that are looking into gas markets, gas prices, supply side, demand side. So we don't keep our gas prices flat. Our teams are looking into the innovation that we experience in the industry, the cost reductions and the wheeling processes, and the impact that this has, like, globally. So our overall view is that the gas price in the US will slightly increase. It will go up to $6 per MMBtu by 2030, and the global gas market is transitioning from an oil-linked market to a market that is linked to the LNG price, with the US being the swing supplier. But yes, we do have a gas team that is looking into the dynamics, the innovation, and the efficiency improvements in the industry.
And I'd add that between this year and last year, our gas price that we feed into this is down 11% based on some of the work that we've done. So every year we're trying to track it at an input level to see how much, because we know that the innovation in unconventional gas exploration equals the innovation in renewable energy. And so there is this sort of battle for price supremacy. Our conclusions are ultimately that the technology, the punching out of solar panels in factories in China, will beat digging things out of the ground. When it does, and how those price dynamics work is a fantastic question. And I alluded to it before, which is that, yeah, you know, there will be swings and roundabouts, and we've got to draw a line in the sand somewhere to come up with, you know, to conclude. But it's certainly something to watch. And I think that if we see a lot cheaper gas, then is it going to be cheap enough to displace coal without carbon pricing or something to really move those two on an operational basis? In some parts of the world, maybe. Is it going to be cheap enough to undercut renewables on their march? Maybe for a time. I think our longer term conclusion is that it's a matter of when, not if, and that when is a grey area that is affected by exactly the dynamics that you outlined.
Okay, one final question, which I ask pretty much everybody who comes here and does an Outlook, and they hate this question, so I'm sorry in advance. But you know, one of the things you get for putting together an Outlook and helping us with our public discourse about where energy is going is that every year people want more and better and different information from you. And so I always ask, what do you think you're going to look at next year that you wish you had done this year, or in innovation on, like, what are the parts of your Outlook that make you a little bit nervous? What are the parts that you'd like to improve upon? Sensitivity analysis, those other sorts of things. You mentioned you have an EV report coming out. You guys put out so much stuff all year long that I know it's a kind of a cumulative thing. But when you think about your Outlook for next time around, what do you think you want to take a closer look at?
I would say that it took us 6 to 8 months to put this thing together, and we always wish we had more time to include more things and do more and more and more. There are some standard areas that we are always looking at, like the experience curves, all these things that Seb mentioned. One thing that we saw, and we expect to see more and more things happening, is the demand side. So as I mentioned, traditionally demand was fixed, load profiles were fixed, pretty standard stuff, and then the supply side had to match this. We see that there is more flexibility, demand response, it is all this AC penetration, for example, in countries like India, things that are changing the load, and now, this can have a material impact on how the system is absorbing electricity. So that's definitely something that we want to look into. And
I'd add hybrid systems, which we capture in an indirect way. We've seen some pretty impressive price points in the US, in Hawaii, and just recently there was a price point of sort of $50 or around that for a solar battery hybrid. We're doing a whole bunch of work on this at the moment, and it's likely that next time we will try and include these as an explicit class, because if the price gets right, then you've got a relative, probably a lower capacity factor, but a dispatchable renewable asset. That if that's price competitive, you start to have all sorts of interesting ramifications. So we're going to look at that, and that may be a feature next year in a meaningful way. And the other final thing I think that we're always trying to do is expand. I mean, to do these, if you try and do the whole world at once and every single element, you never get there. So there's all sorts of things to improve. But certainly on the EV side, we need to capture more of the vehicle market over time, and also on the ancillary services, making sure that the system, having a more robust way of making sure that the system can balance itself on the very short time frames, and that's a role for batteries really. I'm not sure we got to the batteries question actually, did we? We didn't.
Bill, I'm sorry. That's my fault. Batteries.
Which I think is an important. It's certainly in our numbers at the moment, but I think we can do more to make sure that the system that we're painting is robust and not too theoretical from a generation perspective, but actually holds water under some sort of more extreme conditions.
Yeah. No, and sorry, we were actually talking about that before we came down, Bill, so that's probably why I thought we had sort of covered it. But increasingly, sort of the functionality of batteries, the different functions they serve within the market, how that feeds into the demand side as well is an increasingly important dynamic. But you guys have kind of pushed the curve this year and looking at that in different ways too. So, okay, well, I just want to say thank you very much for presenting the New Energy Outlook 2017 here. We really appreciate it. We hope to come back next year to do it again. So thanks very much for joining us. Thanks.